Welcome back to the Hazmat Files, the podcast that dives into the high-stakes world of hazardous materials and emergency response. I'm your host, Erica Fisher, and today we're zeroing in on one of the most complex environments first responders can face, chemical facilities. Whether it's a leak, fire, explosion, or unknown release, these sites demand precision, awareness, and the right questions asked at the right time. So today we're walking through essential information every responder should know about arriving on scene. A quick note, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of TransCare or its sponsoring organizations. The content provided is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal or professional advice. To help us unpack what first responders need to know most about responding to a chemical facility, we're joined by two seasoned voices who are no strangers to the Hazmat Files. With 65 years of combined experience at facilities, I'm pleased to welcome back Pete Kirk and Keith Silverman. Additionally, for this episode, we are joined by Brian Ramsey. Brian has more than 37 years of experience in emergency response. He recently concluded a distinguished 35-year career as fire chief at Eastman Chemical Company in Kingsport, Tennessee. He is now the owner and manager of Emergency Response Training Group, where he provides professional emergency response training to a variety of organizations and first responders. Let's jump into today's episode. You've just arrived. Before responders can act, they need clarity. Keith, what is the best way for responders to identify what chemicals are stored or used on site?
Hi, Erica. Thanks for having me on again. It's really a pleasure to be here. Haven't been in hundreds of plants over my career. What really amazes me is how different each one is. You'll see chemical facilities ranging in size from 3 or 4 people to hundreds or even thousands of people on site. I would say, thinking about it that way, the best way is visit the site, meet the key site people before an incident happens. It's always going to be best to get in there and meet each other before an incident happens. And at these meetings, you have a chance also to request specific information or equipment you might like to have ready when you arrive. Maybe electronic SDSs, master keys or master cards, maps highlighting locations of hazmat material, Title 3 or right to know information, etc., stuff like that. So those visits allow you to get that information, but then it also allows you to add that information to your computer-aided dispatch system so that your responders are provided with crucial information en route to the incident. I guess the next best way, if the facility doesn't have all that or you can't get in, is to just ask the security guard at the front gate. Many facilities have 24-hour security. Guards should have access to the site SDSs, cameras, alarm panels, phone numbers for key contacts, etc. So the guards can help you a lot when you get to a site that has a security guard. And then lastly, if you go to a facility that does not have 24-hour security, then you have to go back to your basic hazmat training, and your goal should be timely identification of potential hazards. Look for common clues that we're taught and we know that hazardous materials may be present. Look for containers, shapes of containers, types of containers, and of course, placards, labels, colors, markings, etc.
Keith's mentioned safety data sheets. Pete, is there a safety data sheet available for each chemical on site at the facility? And where else can first responders obtain this information if they haven't made contact with a member of the facility's response team?
Good morning, Erica. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be back. But yes, to your question, every chemical facility must maintain safety data sheets for all chemicals stored or used on their site. These are typically available at central locations such as control room, safety office, or security office, and they can be obtained electronically via the facility's intranet usually. If a responder hasn't made contact with the facility's response team, they can request a SDS from the facility's emergency contact, check posted chemical inventories, or use resources that they have at their disposal. And a main one is Chemtrek. Chemtrek has a database of millions of SDS safety data sheets, so they can get the crucial information from Chemtrek if they need to. It's critical to verify the SDS is current and it matches the chemical's actual identity and concentration on site.
And you're right, Chemtruck has millions of safety data sheets. But even with the information on a SDS, you still need to know what the facility has done prior to the first responders arriving on scene. Brian, can you walk us through a typical emergency response plan for a chemical facility?
Yes, Erica. Couple things. So generally plants, according to OSHA 1910.38, will have their emergency response plans, and they'll have documentation on obviously how to summons help. They may or may not have a emergency response team or ERT, but if they do have an ERT, they'll have specifics on how to summons that team. If they don't, they'll have procedures on how to garner the local emergency response teams or outside municipalities. As far as roles and responsibilities, plants will have defined roles and responsibilities. In other words, what is employees supposed to do in the event of emergency, and who will be the contact person for outside agencies, or who will assume the roles and responsibilities for managing the emergency on site. A couple other things that come to mind on particular emergency response plans. Generally, plants will conduct what we call site vulnerability analysis, where they'll look at what are the potentials for fires, what are the potentials for chemical spills. They'll even look at natural and man-made disasters and plan accordingly. If there are ways that they will implement safeguards to those, right? Every plant should have emergency notification systems where they can, one, notify all affected employees at the plant and that plant site. Sometimes they'll use PA systems. Nowadays, there's some really sophisticated software out there that they can use to notify plant employees. And they can do that through two-way radio messaging, plant signage, and even text messages. And then also, as far as notifications, they'll use that same notification system to notify the local emergency responders as well. Other parts of the emergency response plan talk about protective actions. For employees, generally we divide those into three categories. You would have shelter in place, evacuations, and then even assembly points. And depending on the type of emergency, you may have folks, and this is generally going to be shelter in place. And there's a lot of reasons for this. With chemical plants, they just can't turn them on or turn them off. They have to go down to what we call steady state. And in order to do that, a chemical facility, they'll have critical operators, we'll call them critical control rooms. And these operators will remain with specific protections in the control room to bring an operation down to steady state as not to exacerbate the emergency. So you have those protective actions that are planned for. In addition, community notifications. Plants are generally working with the community that they are surrounded by. And your local 911, for example, they'll have either reverse 911 or hyper reach. If a chemical plant is in what we'll call a process upset, they can reach out to the community through either reverse 911 or a hyper reach to let them know of an emergency. And then community involvement, obviously, most plants are well engaged with the LEPCs. So they do some planning as well, preemptive planning and pre-plans for either site familiarization and meet and greets with plant officials. And then, of course, finally, emergency response plans are usually updated either biannually or as conditions change. And these are specified in OSHA 1910.38. And then there's also some additional guidance for plant facilities through NFPA in 2800.
Thank you so much for that overview on typical emergency response plans. Now, before we dive into the nuts and bolts of on-scene tactics, let's take a step back and look at how preparedness starts long before an incident. When it comes to chemical facilities, training and equipment are everything. So let me ask you, Pete, to what level are chemical emergency response teams typically trained, and what emergency response equipment does a facility typically have?
Thank you for that question, Erica. Chemical facilities response teams are usually trained to the hazardous materials technician level, with some members reaching specialist level and or incident commander certification, depending on the facility's risk profile. And in my company, no different. Our teams are all hazmat technician level, and they're all trained in fire 1 and 2, and also have that hazardous material technician level and some specialists. And we do have incident commanders in-house at our sites. The training covers chemical identification, PPE selection, decontamination, and air monitoring equipment, and emergency response procedures to specific risks at your site. All our sites have pre-plans, and they drill all year long on these pre-plans. The typical equipment includes chemical protective suits, air monitoring devices, spill containment kits, capping kits for rail cars, emergency offloading devices for trailers, plug and patch kits, specialized tools, non-sparking tools, leak control kits. The exact inventories varies from site to site of what they need in their emergency response equipment. But responders at that site should always confirm what's available during their pre-incident planning and share that with the local responders, right? It's that communication and sharing of information, that relationship that you build with your emergency responders in the community, and make sure they know what you have.
Hey, Erica, if I can just add on to what Pete said. Totally agree with everything Pete said. And as I mentioned earlier, chemical facilities really vary in size and complexity. And I think what I've learned is many of the large sites have some type of on-site ERT and preparedness. However, if you look at the size of the site, that does not necessarily directly correlate to the level of chemical or mechanical hazards present and the level of preparedness. So sometimes smaller sites may have chemical hazards that are greater or equal to larger sites. And in a lot of cases, they may have a lower level of preparedness, so just because of the size of it. So you have to look at each site individually. And then the other thing I just want to note too that Pete said was that when you're talking about incident management, right, it's really important to look at the incident management expectations for the sites. Some sites, like the larger sites, will take the incident commander role, or they'll default right to a unified command structure with the individual incident commanders. But a lot of sites will just call 911, as Brian said, and then they'll expect the local responders to be the incident commanders. So I can't stress enough, go visit and learn before the incident occurs.
Yep.
Absolutely. That pre-planning sounds like it's a critical element in successful emergency response at these facilities. Now, shifting our focus a bit to the human element of a chemical facility incident, the responders have to be thinking, who's been affected? Are there any injuries or exposed personnel? And then also, what role does decontamination play in the first 15 minutes from a responder's perspective?
So first, let's look at, you got to understand what you need to decon for, right? So get the SDS, learn about the chemical, learn about its health effects. If there's a health and safety professional or a knowledgeable person about the process available on site, or even by phone, consult with them. They'll have sometimes site-specific decon procedures. So understanding what you need to decon is key. Then determine who's been affected and to what level. Brian mentioned it before. Sometimes we have folks sheltering in place, and those people, even though they're inside the plant, they're sheltered in place, so they're not necessarily exposed and don't necessarily need decon. For the folks who are exposed, then you have to figure out if they're exposed to solids, liquids, vapors, because the different states of matter are going to result in different levels of exposure and maybe even different decon techniques. And that'll be something that we'll need to take into account. The other thing is act fast, right? Get in there, use the emergency and our gross decon techniques that hazard materials responders have been trained on, but use what's available at the site to aid in that. So if individuals remove outer clothing immediately, this is usually going to remove a significant portion of the contamination. For non-caustic chemicals, a lot of times you'll just be able to use wipes or blotting techniques to decon. For some of those highly volatile chemicals, maybe PPV fans could speed up the volatilization and help in decon. for the caustic chemicals or visible skin contamination, then look for the safety showers in sight. We can use all those showers to get folks underwater quick and start to get that decon going. And then the last thing is that you don't really have to worry about on sites is that most sites have specialized sewer systems that contain the water runoff from production and process buildings, and they're held on site in a lagoon or pond before they're released. So this eliminates the need for responders to set up decon runoff and handle runoff, things like that. So take advantage of the site. The site is set up that employees may be exposed accidentally to chemicals. Use that to your advantage with decon. And then I think lastly, I'll just add, some chemicals require specialized decon procedures. Like if you're using hydrofluoric acid, there may be calcium gluconate solutions that you need to use for decon to help neutralize the chemical. So being aware of those specialized decon procedures will help in an emergency.
And as responders begin to stabilize the scene, or at least understand the immediate threat, it's time to dig a little deeper. Let's discuss the facility's built-in defenses. Keith just mentioned one about potential containment system for any runoff. Brian, could you provide a general overview of typical facility ventilation and suppression systems when incidents occur?
Yes, Erica, thanks. Couple of things. So most of your plants will fall under the PSM or Process Safety Management regulations. And in the PSM, there's a lot of things that take place. For example, plants go through very extensive PHAs or process hazard analysis. And then they'll also do the LOPA analysis or layers of protection analysis, which really drives down to looking at system failure. So part of that, when they do their PHAs and the layers of primary analysis, what they will do is we'll talk about deluge systems or sprinkler systems. And one of the pieces that really helps that, when we're talking about deluge systems and sprinkler systems, they provide an overwhelming layer of protection for emergency responders. And when I'm thinking about that, one of the things that I look at is with a deluge system, they're usually driven by a couple of things. One, they could be driven by actual fire, or in the event of a chemical release that involves a flammable, a lot of these deluge systems are initiated just on LEL. So if there's a detection of the lower explosive limit of a vapor or gas, these deluge systems will trigger. And we're talking some of these deluge systems over 3,000 GPMs, which is a lot of water, which will mitigate a lot of risk. Other types of systems, for example, you have a lot of warehouses possibly with storage. They're protected either with a dry or wet system, depending on whether they're heated or not. And these dry systems and wet systems, in the event of a fire or an emergency, is really a game changer that most fire departments and hazmat teams are not used to outside in the community, right? So all of these are inherently safer designs for chemical plants, and they mitigate quite a bit of risk if each plant is so equipped. The other piece that is important to note is that many of these plants will have gaseous suppression systems on their critical infrastructure. So their server rooms, all of their process logic controls, all their DCS or digital control systems for their operating systems are all protected by gaseous suppression systems. And then lastly, a lot of their processes are protected either by scrubbers. In other words, if things go wrong, then they can vent to scrubbers or they can vent to flares. And these flares are game changers in helping prevent unwanted emissions out in the environment. So these are just a few of the critical aspects that plants have that you don't see out in the normal community.
And Keith, as you discussed during decontamination, understanding the chemicals' effects is critical. Responders also have to think about chemical interactions. One spill is bad, two incompatible ones could be catastrophic. Keith, how do responders know if there are any incompatible chemicals on site?
I'm going to go back to what I said before. Get in and visit the site. I mean, that's the best way. And even as a responder, you cannot visit. There's probably someone from the local AHJ, for example, the fire marshal, who's likely visiting the site, right? So you can get information from them on the locations and quantities of the hazardous materials, where unstable, reactive, or incompatible chemicals may be stored on site, and then get that into your CAD systems so it gets to your responders en route to the scene. The other thing you can do is those site safety and health professionals we talked about, those folks are going to use NFPA 400, which is the hazardous material code. It's the same code that the AHJ is going to be looking at to set the safety requirements on site for things like the storage, handling, and use of all those hazardous materials. So during an incident, a knowledgeable person like that EHS person, you could get them on the phone, or if they're there at the incident, get them to the command post. This way you can consult with them during the incident, and they can help you set your incident objectives and help you with the tactics you're going to take. If you could get that subject matter expert, that EHS person, to the command post, I always recommend getting them there and keeping them there. If there's no knowledgeable person there on site or by phone, then call Chemtrek. Chemtrek has that reach. Pete was talking about it before. Besides the SDSs, Chemtrek has a huge reach. They'll be able to call those subject matter experts from the company. And if they can't get them from the company, they just have a large reach out to other folks who know about the industry, know about chemicals, and they can help in an emergency. And then the last and most basic thing goes back to our training. Again, look for clues, look for signage, look for marked storage areas that are going to indicate you have these reactive and or incompatible chemicals. You may see oxidizers or organic peroxide signage or separate storage rooms. You may see signage for unstable chemicals like monomers or ammonium nitrate. You might see special types of storage or containment, environmental containment, runoff spill containment for things like corrosives. Likely pyrophorics will have special markings, toxics, water reactives, etc. The list goes on. So really look for those clues that help identify that they're there.
Next, widening our lens a bit, the chemical facility isn't the only thing at risk during an incident. Responders have to be thinking, what could the environmental risks be to the general public? Pete, how do facilities plan for and manage risks within the surrounding community?
The environmental risks at the different facilities throughout the country and throughout the world where we operate includes air, water, and soil contaminations from the leaks, spills, or fires, if you have one. Facilities usually have engineered controls like secondary containment, scrubbers, and emergency shutdown systems that they try to manage these risks with. And to Keith's earlier point, the larger facilities have well-stocked emergency response departments that are trained, not so for the smaller ones. The community risk management, it involves doing regular drills with your community responders as a company, public notification systems. In the larger facilities, they try to get what they call a buffer zone, more property around. So it gives us a little more time in the event of something happening, that we have a little more time before it gets out of our location and into the public. But doing regular drills with the community responders and the local emergency planning committees, the LEPCs, and having that quick communication to your emergency management system, the county or the parish emergency manager, having that great relationship, inviting them to drills in your site and working with them, that's immeasurable.
To navigate some of the factors during an incident, you need a guide. And we've already mentioned EHS specialists or on-site emergency response teams. But Brian, who is typically the facility's best emergency contact or chemical specialist during an incident, and how do they support the local responders?
A couple of things on that. We're in a different landscape, as you know, where different folks move. In other words, tenure can change and experience can be different at every chemical facility. I spent 35 years at a large chemical facility, kind of like Pete mentioned, where we had our own ERT team. But I work hand in hand now with a lot of small companies that don't have one or they have a smaller one. And of course, through turnover, attrition, and things, those change. But I want to go back to what Keith mentioned. It is imperative that local organizations reach out in a timely fashion and talk to that chemical facility and find out who that person is. You talked about who is my contact person, because you can have a contact person at a facility and they basically open up the gates for you to get inside and learn more about it. But when I start thinking about specific actions, I go back to some of the most knowledgeable people at a chemical plant are the process operators. And those process operators hold very in-depth knowledge about that plant and its risk, and that's often overlooked. So to circle back to your point, establish a contact with somebody, but if there is a true emergency, work through the instant command system, which is always paramount, but work through that instant command system, but work to drill down to that specific knowledge in a sector, right? What is actually causing the problem and who has the most knowledge? Because here's one thing that I learned over 35 years. At chemical facilities, there is a wealth of knowledge. You just got to tap into the right piece of knowledge. And again, going back to your point, visit the chemical plant, learn who your contact person is, and then look to the specific areas that you need specific knowledge for, because there is a lot of knowledge around the processes.
And as we bring today's conversation to a close, let's zoom out for a moment. We have covered pre-incident planning, on-site equipment, and special expertise, as well as key response considerations for first responders when responding to a chemical facility. But if you could speak directly to every responder across the country, one unified message or one call to action, what would you say to them about chemical facility preparedness and response? Keith, how about you kick us off?
All right, Erica. I say go inside the fence line. You have to go inside. Visit the facility, walk around, get to know key individuals, and sit down and have a cup of coffee. Spend time together. And don't forget to ask them for their cell phone numbers, too. This way, if you have an emergency, you have their contact numbers. But you have to get in there and go inside the fence line, because you don't want the first time you meet to be during an emergency.
And Pete, what would your unified message or call to action be for responders?
Preparedness is everything. Along with that, they need to know the resources that they can tap into to come to the scene. Train regularly, build that relationship, to Keith's point, and have those numbers. And when responding, prioritize the safety, verify all information, and communicate clearly. Every incident is unique. You might have to adapt your approach from what you trained, but you have that knowledge of being inside that site and knowing the people. You stay vigilant. Never hesitate to ask questions before you take an action inside the site. But the right preparation and teamwork can turn chaos into control.
And Brian, how about you?
You can't wait on a chemical plant to reach out to the fire department. It goes both ways. I see that a lot where I talk to fire departments. They say, I don't know what they do inside the fence line. I said, have you ever called them? Well, no. Can I do that? Absolutely, you can. And it's a two-way street. Some industry will be very proactive in reaching out to the fire departments. In other industries, I mean, let's face it, we're all very busy in today's environment. So it takes a concentrated effort to put the two together. So I think that's important, and we've mentioned that. The other piece that I will mention is that chemical facilities really try to do the right thing. They really try to work hard. They do things that people don't know they do to make things inherently safer. And again, they just don't get the accolades for that. I think that chemical facilities are working really hard to be safe. So I think if fire departments reach out and learn what they're doing and foster that relationship, responses will go so much better.
Chemical facility responses are high risk, high pressure, and high impact. But with the right questions, you can turn chaos into control. This podcast isn't just for hazmat technicians. They're for every firefighter, EMT, and law enforcement officer who might be first on scene. Share this episode with your crew. Drill with them. And be sure reaching out to the chemical facilities in your community is second nature. To our guests, Pete and Keith, thank you both for joining us again this season. And Brian, We are thrilled to have you join the podcast for the first time. I am truly grateful for everyone's time and willingness to share their insights and experience with our audience. To our listeners, thank you for joining us on the Hazmat Files. If you found this episode helpful, please share it and subscribe to listen to more episodes. Stay safe, stay ready, and we'll see you next time on the Hazmat Files.